Hi, I'm Iolanthe and this is Little Mirrors, and today is our first interview with an expert about integrating personal identity and parenthood. So I'm really excited to introduce you today to Ginny Hartley, who I actually met probably maybe a month into my journey as a new mum, trying to get back onto my feet. Ginny plays a very important role in helping people integrate being a parent and being who they are. She is an occupational therapist and she runs an excellent business called Mumability, and she is also an author with a book that will soon to be released. So today, Ginny and I are just going to have a really casual conversation about what occupational therapy is and how it can support you as you integrate your different roles, whether that's being a full-time at-home mum or being a business owner and a mum or an employee and a mum. I think it will be full of smarts to take away. So, Ginny, I'm really glad you're here, and I'd like you to tell our audience what it is that you do.
Okay, well, first and foremost, an occupational therapist. I sort of see myself as a mental health clinician. I work in the public system at Northwest area mental health, and over the last couple of years, I've started to build up a private practice in Fairfield, and due to COVID, that's ended up mostly online through telehealth over the last year.
Yeah, and what is your business called?
Mumability.
And how did you come up with that name?
Well, that's a good question. It was just a sort of a brainstorming session where I was trying to think about, a positive name that sort of focuses on the fact that, I have a strength-based approach, and always trying to pull out what the mother's strengths are, what, she may not be aware of that she already has within her that she can cultivate in her new role as a mum. So It's really just, trying to sell that idea that, it's about, maximising your independence and your ability in this new role that you've landed yourself in.
Yeah, sounds got good work that would probably make you feel like pleased to do on a daily basis.
Totally, yep.
So a little bit of context as to how I met Ginny. I met Ginny because I was referred to her through my obstetrician. So as I've shared on previous Little Mirrors, after I had our daughter, the first week, after about a week, my mood plunged dramatically, and I had suffered from depression previously, but because I'm resourceful, even despite being very depressed at the time, I managed to reach out to my obstetrician and my psychologist and my doctor to get help so I could get the show on the road. And Ginny was referred to me, as I said, through the obstetrician. So I'd say that I have a great relationship with my psychologist, but for this particular issue, it was not a holistic therapy that I was after. It was actually dealing with a single issue, which was the integration into being a mum. Mm-hmm. It was just being able to get through this little bit of time. It wasn't a long-term. It wasn't a long-term project. It was, please help me now. I need help with this particular issue. So, Ginny, I think that occupational therapy can be a real grab bag term, and it can be hard to understand it. I reckon people kind of get what a psych and a therapist are, mm-hmm. but I think that occupational therapist sits in a different space. Can you tell us a bit about that?
True. It reminds me of when I first was studying occupational therapy, and one of the early lectures was on how are you going to explain yourself at a party. Nobody will know what occupational therapist means. They'll think that you work in occ health and safety. And I guess what it comes down to is occupation is all the activities that make up our life. It can be our interests, cooking, cleaning, could be a job, and being a mum is an occupation as well. And I guess what sets OT apart from psychology is that it's very function orientated around what are you coming for, where in your life are you struggling within the activity side of things, or how you spend your time. So when you become a mum, often that's a big shake up because you've gone from living a life where maybe you had a job and you had your friends and family, and suddenly you land yourself in a new role, and it's new skills. And if you look at it from a practical perspective, it's less daunting, and it's not putting pathology on this transition. It's sort of thinking, okay, well, what let's see what you already have in terms of skills and how we can use that into this new role. So perhaps you are really organised, high functioning in your job. There's strengths as you move into being a mum, but it's also a double-edged sword in that you might have a lot of expectations around, I'm this competent, organised person. How is this little being completely monopolising all my time? I don't feel like I'm succeeding here.
Yeah.
And pointing out that idea that it sounds like, you're using your way of managing your job to expect that in your first few weeks that you're doing as well as in that job you've been doing for 10 years. Just it sort of normalizes, and it just lowers that anxiety. It allows a person to go, oh, okay. Yeah. So it took me a long time to get that good in my career, and yet I'm expecting myself to be all over this new mum role. Plus you've got lots of emotions, positive and maybe sort of more painful, in that you feel love, but you also feel overwhelmed, fear, guilt, and they're all in there at once.
Yeah.
So
I think that sometimes another place that we might regularly hear about occupational therapy is in elder care. So, for example, my grandma has dementia, and she has an occupational therapy doll. It's like a baby that they work with. Can you tell us a little bit about, like, that's more regularly where I hear about occupational therapy? What's the purpose of, just a question, what's the purpose of having a doll or an object in that space?
Well, you're lucky that I did start my working life in aged care, and I remember, doing some sort of reminiscence work where we brought in an old wedding dress, and the idea of the doll is that it takes the person back to an earlier time in their life where they were a mum, and their memory is not so good for the present moment, but their long-term memory is often intact with dementia. So when you put that doll, even though it might sort of feel like, oh, is this a bit contrived, this is a doll, they're able to use that as kind of like a prop to trigger off that memory, and then you'll have some sort of discussion around what that was like, that time in their life, and often they really come to life. They're really focused, engaged, they get sort of like feel good brain chemicals released, and it brings the group together. Whereas if you tried to engage in the present moment, you often lose their attention. Maybe they don't remember your name, but when you put that doll, they might say, oh, I had John, my son, oh yes, I don't know how old he is now, but yeah, oh, as a baby, he'd love to be held. So obviously you need to be careful with the use of the doll. If that person hadn't had children, is not going to engage with that, you try and tap into something of meaning.
And I guess I can see how that works when perhaps supporting a new mother, because I remember in my work with you, you were reconnecting me to my competency, and it was those feelings of competency, and I guess acknowledging the things I had done that were competent, that were able to make me think that, oh yeah, okay, I'm actually doing okay, I'm doing all right here. So what are the ways that an OT can help a new mum, do you think, like the top things?
Well, often a good place to start is to look at the current time use, the routine that's in place, because you'll get a sense of, night and day. If a woman says, oh, I feel like all I do is feed, and you work out that it's actually, they're spending a couple of hours every hour or two on that, then you sort of can feed back to them, okay, so it sounds like more than half your 24 hours is spent in that, yet you're expecting yourself still to complete all your other usual tasks. Like you feel like, you should be able to cook all the meals, keep the house clean, and yet also this little baby is creating lots of laundry, and when they have the feed, then they need to be settled. They don't come into the world in a routine. So it's sort of firstly making them aware that the time to care for a baby is huge, and it's a 24-hour job, and sort of saying, even in our working job we tend to do 8 hours and we get dedicated rest breaks, whereas this job there are no dedicated rest breaks without having another adult available, which may or may not happen. Maybe partners at work find themselves on their own. So yeah, looking at time use, letting them sort of be aware of the demands, and then sort of problem solving together around how that's working well. Is there a need for extra help? And just saying that this is a new routine that you guys are setting up together, and it's going to be unique to you. Let's find out what works, and it could be around thinking about having one of those sleeps out in the pram so that they can get out and walk. So you're sort of thinking exercise is a good way to burn off stress, but you don't have time maybe to go to the gym like you did beforehand, or maybe you love going to Pilates through your pregnancy, and now you find yourself stuck in this house with this baby that just seems to have a bottomless pit of needs. It's sort of saying, okay, well, after the next feed, how about you just pop them in the pram? You can do that even if you're post-Caesar, because you're not carrying the baby, and just take a walk. Babies, even when they're unsettled, they love the sound of traffic and all that sort of white noise. Well, that's what they're used to from when they were inside you. They love the sound of your voice. So instead of going, okay, I want you to take a 30-minute walk every day, because that'll be really good for stress relief, you try to think about how that would fit for them. Or if they're like, no, I never do that. I would never go out walking. Oh my God, I don't look like myself. There's no way I'm going out in this outfit. And you might say, okay, well, these days there's lots of really good online stuff available. How would you feel about a 15-minute stretch session, or some light cleaning is another way to get exercise. As long as you're sort of getting your heart rate up, you're exercising. So sort of thinking about that functional layer of you can move in lots of different ways, and so hopefully that allows them to feel like, oh, okay, so I am still keeping up some level of fitness, but it's understandable my body is recovering from birth.
Yeah.
I often say to women after having a cesarean, this is a major surgery. You've had your abdomen sort of opened up, and ordinarily in life, if you had surgery like that for any other reason, you'd be on bed rest, to be all about your recovery. Everyone would be helping, caring for you, whereas when you have a baby, there isn't that time lag. A baby can't wait until you've recovered, so you just have to step straight into role. And sometimes mother might feel guilty about that, or like, I should be able to manage this, or they're on pain relief because of the massive surgery they've had, so their mind is a bit dulled, and so it's not firing as it normally does, plus they've got the sort of fatigue, and just saying, well, given that you're on this medication and you're only just recovering from major surgery, it's a lot on your body. It doesn't mean that you're not attending to your baby, that it's okay to share that. Or I'll also say to them, there are some cultures that have got some very clear practices in place where you are sort of encouraged to take 40 days out. Within the Greek culture, they really give permission, and it's almost like enforced. Like, no, you can't go out. And the family comes in, and they don't. The woman doesn't feel like she's asking for something special. It's just how the culture works. Whereas I think in our traditional Western world, it's sometimes you don't even know your neighbours.
Yeah.
It would almost feel a bit weird if a neighbour turned up with a chicken casserole. You'd be like, whoa, I don't know you.
Yeah.
So it's sort of saying, I guess let's just map out what the needs are, what's important to you, and because what I love to see is for the woman to feel like she's doing a good enough job. I'll often say you got to stuff things up pretty badly to to impact negatively on a baby. They're pretty resilient. They've gone through birth. You just need to get it right most of the time, or just have a go, or talk to them out loud and say, gosh, you're having a tough time at the moment, because they just love the sound of your voice. And when they were inside you, you were just going about your day chatting. So they're not so interested in the content. They just like the sound of your voice.
Yeah, that was a whole bundle of different ways that you could help a new mum. I like that it was kind of like, I like the general storytelling vibe of that response. So why is it that you think that becoming a mum is such a massive challenge to your identity? Like, I was a little surprised because I had gone into having my baby quite aware of my personality type, which is, I guess you call it like an A-type personality. Even though I consider myself an introvert, because I need a lot of rest time in order to be big. So I knew that I had this drive towards achievement, and that made me feel good. And I was like, oh no, I'm going to not set up too many expectations for myself. I'm not going to focus on having like a non-medicated birth. I'm going to just, I don't want to set myself up to fail. So I felt like I had done some prep work in terms of acknowledging who I am and how I am. But it's like I'd actually, what I hadn't expected was that I would feel as incompetent as I did after I had a baby, or as divorced from my former self, and like I could never get her back. Why is it such a big challenge to your identity as a human when you become a parent?
I guess for a couple of reasons. Firstly, that before you're a mum, there is nothing else comparable to that role. Like you may have a partner that's important to you, and family and friends, but you will have never been in the situation before where you've grown a baby, so you've already had this relationship built before you meet them, and it's emotional in a way that's sort of more intense than any other relationship, because they come into the world completely dependent on you. Like, whether you breastfeed or you're bottle feeding, they're completely reliant on you for everything, for not just feeds, but for the settling, for adjusting to the world, because before they're born, they've had this environment that stays the same. Everything's met for them passively, So I think you're firstly bombarded with the intensity of the dependence, and that they're unpredictable. So you can have spent time with babies. So I've seen lots of nurses and childcare workers that struggle because they feel like, well, I've got competence. I spend my life, helping other babies, get into routines with sleep. And so if they have a baby that sort of doesn't nail that early routine, they feel quite incompetent, like a failure, that this is unreasonable. Why have I not been able to replicate? So there is, I guess you also can't change who you are. So if you said, you know that you're quite high achieving and you like to achieve, you can't sort of dismiss that aspect of yourself just because you're in this new role. It's like, someone telling you to calm down when you feel like in a rage. It's sort of like, you've got to sort of process that. The other thing is that becoming a mum can remind you of being a child yourself, and if you haven't considered before what your own relationship with your mother is like and your family, then often it comes up post-birth. If you've got that support available and mum's around and she's sort of helping you out, mentoring, saying, go and have a lie down, I've got this, or turns up with a meal, obviously that is going to really help. But if she's absent because of either she's no longer in this world or there's conflict, then that's going to be amplified, because here you are at a vulnerable time where you just need a bit of support, a little bit of reassurance. And yes, sure, your partner's there doing that, but I think being a mum reminds you of the fact that you had a mum once where you were a baby. And there's a term called ghosts in the nursery, and it's been well researched that it's quite normal that our past comes through as we're parenting, and that can be also a positive experience. You might find yourself singing a tune and thinking, I had this song sung to me, and so just something like Rockabye Baby, you might find yourself singing and sort of thinking, I feel like I'm handing that down, or a book. But it could also be that perhaps for whatever reason that the care wasn't readily available. Many decades ago it was considered that children were meant to be seen and not heard, be quiet. Controlled crying was all the rage. It was you were encouraged to put the child down and shut the door and don't go near them, and they'll learn to sleep through the night. And now we sort of know that babies aren't ready for that when they're born. They think that means you're gone. So they will ultimately be quiet, but it's not a great start.
Okay. It's interesting that you speak about that ghost in the nursery, which I think is a fascinating idea. What I found with my daughter when she was first born is that she looked so much like me when I was a baby. I found it arresting. I found that I was looking at a baby version of me. It was quite an unusual experience, and it brought up a lot of quite griefy feelings. When I look at her now, I can still see that she looks like me, but I can see more of my husband in her, and I can see my parents in her. I can see more than just me in her, and that feeling kind of passed, I would say. What are some signs that you might need a bit of support when you've got a new baby? What are some signs that you might need support?
Well, I think the first thing is to reassure people that there is always a natural transition post-birth where all your hormones are all over the shop, because we have all these hormone changes to support pregnancy that then drop suddenly after you give birth, which is to move to this next stage of the body prepares itself for breastfeeding, and there's prolactin and things, but there are other hormones that drop down. So there is a general drop in mood that is just biological, and those first 5 days post-birth, if you're teary, if you just don't feel like yourself, you feel happy one minute, anxious the next, that's just that normal, that's called the postpartum blues. So I always say to people, that first week really don't need to draw too much attention to it meaning anything other than rest and recovery, nutrition, all those sort of obvious self-care needs. Sort of go, you've just had this major experience of birth, your body's recovering. Yes, I know you've got this new baby to attend to, but when you can rest, that will help your body recover. You said about the looking at her and feeling quite overwhelmed. There's just a huge emotional charge that happens when you're first given birth, because you're exhausted, and you've just gone through this very unique experience. There is nothing like having a birth. Even if it's planned and you're booked in for a cesarean, you can't really completely appreciate what that's going to be like. And the same with birth. If it's natural birth, you don't know when it's going to come on. You don't get a memo saying, on this day, you're going to go into labour, and so it's, you sort of have to pivot quickly into that. So sorry, you mentioned like what are the other signs?
Yeah.
I guess it would be, just could be obvious changes in personality. If you're usually someone that's pretty go with the flow, and you're finding heightened sense of anxiety, so changes in heart rate and breathing rate, tension, and it doesn't sort of ever go away. So you might have your baby settled down to sleep and you're not able to relax then, or they're sleeping at night and you're just wide awake, wired, and not able to sort of take that rest time. Just not perhaps getting the enjoyment from the experience that you would hope for, so that you're mechanically going through the motions. You might be sort of still attending to the baby's needs, but there's no sort of response in you where you sort of get that enjoyment. So you're holding the baby, and ideally you sort of get sort of a bit of a feel good release, a bit like you get when you exercise. If you haven't had a baby, you then sort of feel it when you just have the baby in your arms. There's just this moment where you can just connect. If you're feeling anxious, it's really hard to just surrender to that. But we often look for changes in sleep, not being able to eat, not getting the usual enjoyment, perhaps having some really strong sort of fearful or negative thoughts about yourself that you're not able to sort of put aside. Whereas I guess if you're not at that point of needing help, you might notice that thought and share it with someone, and then realise when you see it out there in the open, oh, that's a bit it's a bit harsh, like I can see that is not quite the situation. Well, that's a bit of a silly thought. Or the other person says, oh yeah, I used to think like that too, and you go, oh, okay, thank goodness. Right, okay. And then you can put it aside and go on with what you need to do. And I guess your energy levels are going to feel sort of taxed, where you just sort of don't feel like you've got that motivation and energy. Like your mind tells you that you need to do it, and you feel bad that you're not, but you just don't have that get up and go, or maybe you don't want to get out of bed, or you don't go to bed. Look,
I think that being able to recognise when you need support is obviously really individual, and some people are probably more avoidant or looking for inner resources than others who are happy to look outwards. What I did find interesting is that at the same time as I'd had a baby, 2 other women that I knew who were a similar age to me, and they were I guess professionally also similarly focused, they had kids as well. And I checked in with them maybe 3 weeks after their baby, and they asked how I'd gone, and I told them about how great it was, but also told them about how awful that I felt for a couple of weeks, and how I felt really scared, and I felt depressed, and like, maybe, oh, I'm not made out to be a mum or something like that. And my disclosure of that allowed them to express how they felt as well. So I think that a lot of these feelings, when we're integrating new roles, they're fairly typical from what I can see. They're not that unusual. And thus it would seem to me that being able to get support so that time is less fraught and frightening would be sensible.
Totally. I mean, that idea of having that thought of, I don't know whether I'm cut out for this role, that sort of thought can really snowball. But if you share it with someone that is your confidant, that you trust, that is going to be able to meet you with some validation, normalisation, then that's going to diffuse. And you go, okay, so lots of people have that thought. Okay, so I don't have to freak out. The other thing is that people fear child protection services, that if I'm to disclose, the thought I'm having, and like it's not uncommon to have, even some really scary thoughts like wanting to harm the baby. And I often say to people, you just have to be careful who you choose to say that to, because once you share it with a professional, there's mandatory reporting. They will have to go and make a report. But that thought in itself often comes from fatigue, overwhelm, not feeling in control. And I just I hope for anyone that has that thought that they have that opportunity to share it with someone that can point that out. That's okay. Like, it's really good just to put it out there on the table. If you keep it inside and ruminate on it, and it'll grow, and you'll be like, wow, I shouldn't be having that thought. Like, oh, that's a horrible thought. And it's like, well, it's not a thought where you want to act on it. It's just an intrusive, fearful thought. And how everything that goes through our brain is not all fact. But it all comes out the same way. Because if we're like, take the position of a woman who's walking through a car park late at night, it's not weird that you're going to have your keys in your hand and then you might imagine that somebody might attack you. That's not because somebody is going to attack you or because you hope they will. It's just a thought. Totally. I mean, it's a really good example, and often it helps to do that with someone, to use that analogy and go, well, it's just the same. Our brain is sort of wired to keep us safe, and it works in that sort of automatic way, whether it's real and someone is going to rob you, or you're just in a situation where it could happen. So yeah, it's a good example.
So Ginny, in closing, I'd love to know why it is that you do this important work.
I guess because one, I love being a mum myself. My boys bring me lots of satisfaction, and just nothing challenges you more being a mum, because I think everyone wants to do their best, but when your emotions are involved, you don't always get it right. But I think what I love is being able to help people get to the other side of that transition and be able to say, I'm actually doing a pretty good job, or I haven't nailed everything, but I know that I'm doing my best, and that's enough. And for them to just to feel like they're doing a good enough job is huge. I sort of feel like if I can make that difference, and they can go on and be present and make time for themselves too. Like I often say to mums, you don't have to put everything into this role, that it's totally okay to go back to work. Like men do it all the time without a second thought, and people don't say to men when they come back from their paternity leave, oh, where's the baby? Have you got family looking after them? But whereas that's the number one question for a woman is, so how did you get to be here? Oh, how did you do it? And it's like, well, sometimes that is the best thing you can do for you, is to step back into that role and have a bit of balance, whenever's right for you. Like I think there's judgment out there that we can't avoid, but we just need to be tuned in and noticing if it's coming up for us, and sort of think, because people make inappropriate comments as well about parenting. I think any mum probably can relate to going to the supermarket with a baby that probably is a bit ratty, tired, and everyone looks, or people have comments, and it starts in pregnancy and it carries through, I think, throughout being a mum, and a dad. It's just this idea that people can give comments, even though it's deeply personal, and really they would have no idea what your baby needs, but they put their 2 cents in, and it's well-meaning. But if you're feeling anxious, it's enough to just send you. I've known women who've said this to me, I left my trolley and I just left.
Yeah,
it's easier just to flee, and I'll send my husband out to get milk. I can't handle this staring and having to deal with this baby that's
at the same time.
Yeah.
So I would recommend occupational therapy. I of course recommend Ginny. I worked with Ginny for maybe 4 or 5 weeks. It was not a very long period of time, but it helped to allow me to recognise my innate competence in the face of me feeling like I wasn't doing things properly, or I wasn't doing things well enough. But really, when you're judging yourself in that state, you have no point of comparison. You've only got the prior you, which is at a high level of competency. If you're having a child, your first child at 38, you've only got this really highly competent person to compare yourself to, and that's not a really fair. It's not a fair comparison, and unless you are surrounded by people who are happy to share experiences of early parenting with you, it's very hard to know what's normal. I also find that a lot of people, and I'm sure this will happen to me, a lot of people, when you ask them about their early child days, early parenting days, they can't remember it, and whether that's because it's a very stressful experience, or in order for biology to continue, our brains make sure that we forget the horrible things so we can go on to have more kids. That tends to be something you don't get that insight. They just remember the beauty of the baby, but they don't remember the pain and the tears and the fear that can also come as part of that emotional package. So I'm really pleased to hear that Ginny is also finished a book. What's that book called, Ginny?
It's called Take a Journey to Calm.
Yep, that sounds good to me.
Yeah.
And when are you thinking that's going to be released?
Well, I'd say in the next month or 2. Cool. It's just going through the sort of rigorous proofreading through a self-publisher at the moment.
Cool.
So, yeah, I hope to be able to share it with you and have it available as an electronic book and a hard copy book.
So we will share the link to both Mumability, which is Ginny's website. I work with Ginny via Zoom, so Zoom was also effective. I didn't need to see her in person necessarily. And we'll also share a link when it's ready to Ginny's book. Ginny, thank you so much for coming and speaking on the really important topic of occupational therapy. I think it's a really incredibly powerful and useful support for people, and if anybody has any questions about OT, what my experience was like, or what it's like to work with an OT, direct to Ginny, please do so. I'm Iolanthe, this is Ginny Hartley, and this is Little Mirrors.